This is Axel Rudakubana, responsible for one of the most barbaric crimes in our country's history, IET Cooper has declared. She set out details for a public inquiry into the Southport attack, the Home Secretary told the Commons. She's ordered a thorough review of Rudakubana's referrals to the Prevent Anti-Terror Programme to, quote, identify what changes are needed to make sure serious cases are not missed. Let's have a listen to what the Home Secretary said. This is in the last 10 or 15 minutes.
It is for the police and CPS to decide whether individual cases meet the definition set out in the Terrorism Act 2000 when making charges. But given the growing number of cases where perpetrators are seeking to terrorise, even without a clear ideology, we need to ensure the law, powers and sentencing are strong enough to cope. I have therefore asked the independent reviewer on terrorism powers to examine the legislation in this area in the light of the modern threats we face.
Well, this comes as Keir Starmer admitted knowing about Rudakubana's terror links, but says he couldn't make the information public due to concerns over prejudicing a trial. Let's speak with Luke Gittos, lawyer, a writer and director of the Freedom Law UK. Luke, afternoon to you. I mean, this has every bit of ingredient, doesn't it? It's got information, it's got misinformation, it's got emotion, which is at the centre of all of this as well. Is the question we've been throwing out, what should the Prime Minister have said? IET Cooper clarifying their current position. What is your take on this? And I know you wrote a really interesting piece for Spiked Online on this point back in November. What was missing from this story?
Well, I think we learnt everything that we could learn at the time that we could have learnt it. It was a very long-winded way of saying that there were obviously really strict rules around what could and couldn't be said about this case when the defendant was first arrested. And if these details, such as the fact that he was found with a terror manual, the fact that he had tried to produce ricin, if these details had made it into the public realm, then Keir Starmer is right to say that that could have put a trial at risk. The real risk being that he could never be tried fairly because of the potentially inadmissible material that couldn't or shouldn't have been heard by the jury getting into the public domain. His defence lawyers would then have had a very good argument to say, well, this guy can't be trusted fairly because there is so much inadmissible material in the public realm. We can't hope to have a fair jury for him. And perhaps it's egging it slightly highly to say that that would have completely prevented him being tried and him walking as a free man. I think that's probably unrealistic. But nonetheless, it would have created real difficulty for the trial judge, for the trial lawyers, and it would have created a lot of problems. So I think what the public inquiry will probably reveal, and it's always dangerous to hedge your bets like this, but I imagine that Keir Starmer, he is if he is one thing, he's definitely a lawyer. He knows the law inside out. He will have known at the time what he could and couldn't say. He would have been advised properly on it. And I think that's probably what will emerge in the inquiry. What is more interesting here is, I think, what the inquiry is going to uncover about motive, about what kind of state agencies dropped the ball when it came to this individual, whether or not this is properly described as a terrorist incident. You know, what we are seeing is some real umming and ahhing about whether to describe this as a terrorist incident because the police are still refusing to do so. Yeah. It looks like there is conflicting evidence about precisely what Rudakubana's motive was. We know that he downloaded a terror manual. That looks like it could be clear-cut. But of course, he also attempted to commit a knife rampage at his old school 4 years ago in response to being bullied. So this is someone who looks like he responds to, you know, emotional upset with monstrous and extreme violence. So we may not know whether this is a terror incident or not. It would not have been right for Keir Starmer to come out and say at the time, well, this is definitely a terrorist incident, because there just wasn't the evidence to suggest that there was. And I think those people that are claiming vindication, particularly online now, saying, well, here you go, we knew all along this was connected with terror, and we've been proved right. I think they're probably speaking a little bit too soon, because Rudakubana looks like a very deeply troubled individual, probably motivated by all sorts of things that we might not even know about yet. He looks like a sort of basement-dwelling individual who doesn't appear to be attached to any particular political cause. You know, there is some information that he was raised Catholic, but beyond the connection to the Al-Qaeda manual. There's nothing to suggest he was interested in Islam or radical Islam or anything similar. So it's right to say that it's still the case that a lot of misinformation was circulated after this chap was arrested, and that is dangerous. And that's
I was just going to add into that, Luke. You know, doing this job as a journalist and working in newsrooms, you know, you do get bits of information from journalists that are on the ground. They'll speak to a police officer off the record. You know, those kind of conversations do go on, and you hear rumblings. I remember hearing the rumblings of, you know, they found things in his house, not specifically what, but that could link him to terrorism. But then the next thing I heard was the reason they're not talking about that is because they need to establish, was this guy linked to somebody else in the terror network? And had they let that information be known, that could have scuppered another trial somewhere else. There's all of this stuff. There's a good reason why information doesn't come out, because it can lead to lots of misinformation. It can lead to collapsing a trial, or certainly bolstering a defence case over a trial for things that become, as you rightly say, inadmissible. And so that's the reason we have these laws in place. And I get that. There is still a sense, though, that when Starmer said, you know, I couldn't have said anything, is there something he could have said? Could he not have said, look, there's a lot of information this guy arrived on a Channel boat? He didn't. There's a lot of information he's an illegal immigrant. He isn't. We can say that much. Or does that then get into the realms of, hang on, running commentary from Prime Minister every time there's an incident?
Yeah, I think that's what they will be balancing at the time that these kind of incidents occur. They're attempting to balance satiating the public, the legitimate public demand for information, with the need to keep things private and to make sure that they have an impact on other investigations or other potential criminal cases. I mean, as you suggest, you know, there were rumblings at the time that he'd been found with particular documents, and maybe Keir Starmer should have said more, but this will come out in the public inquiry. I think so far he's broadly trod the correct line. And I do think, you know, we must remember that in the aftermath of this incident, there was a fake name circulating about who this attacker was. Yeah. There was fake information, specific information, that he'd arrived on a boat during 2023 as an asylum seeker. All turned out to be completely false. And so there is a justifiable concern that outright lies and misinformation can circulate very quickly. But I do think governments in the future will be more wary of the need to give the public something in order to make sure there's no vacuum into which that misinformation can step, because I think that's what happened here. It was the silence from the government and from the state agencies that allowed this information to start circulating.
And the other point that doesn't get talked about very much, of course, is when this incident happened, he was legally still a child, the perpetrator here. So that presumably would have had a factor on events. It might have been different had it been an adult, I don't know. And of course, he was never charged. The murders he was charged with were not terror related, and that's interesting. I mean, lots of people say, well, hang on, sometimes the police do say we're treating this as a terror incident. Other times it's not a terror incident. I'm trying to think where there was one recently, I think it was in another country, where they said initially it's a terror. It was in America, wasn't it, when there was an incident there. It's a terror incident. No, it's not a terror incident. Oh, yeah, it is a terror. No, we aren't. Yes, we are. No, there's a lot of that goes on depending on who you speak to. The FBI say one thing, the New York Police Department say another, etc. So you always have these problems. Anne makes this point, though, Luke. She says, knowing it's a terror-related crime means you can be on alert for more attacks. Misinformation from overseas contributed to the riots. I felt it was implied that the perpetrator was a young, angelic choir boy who possibly had mental health issues. Well, I think people said that online. I don't know if anybody officially said that. But is it useful to know that it could be a terror attack, because that bolsters our awareness that, you know, there might be a new vibe or a new group out there somewhere, or is that also dangerous?
Well, look, the legal test for classifying an incident as terrorist-related, or a terror incident in the eyes of the state, is about motivation. It's about why the person has carried out this crime, and it triggers certain other steps to be taken by the relevant state agencies. So that's why that designation is important. And I think the reason why this attack hasn't been designated in that way is because we're still unsure of his precise motive. And those motives look mixed and complicated. You know, this is very different to something like the Woolwich terror attack, the stabbing of Lee Rigby, where Michael Adebolajo stood in the middle of the road shouting jihadist slogans immediately after the attack. There was no doubt in that incident that this was motivated by jihadism. But that's not the case here. And so the police and the relevant agencies can't just designate an incident a particular way because they think it will satisfy the public.
Yeah.
And they can't do it because they just want to appear to be doing the right thing. They need to do it because it's justified. And in this case, it wasn't.
A lot of people have said, well, what about the photo of this guy? Why did we not see the photo? In fact, Dallas has just said, what influence did Keir Starmer have on the censorship of the picture of the killer looking like a total raving psycho rather than the totally innocuous one from his child? Well, Starmer wouldn't have had any influence on that at all. But of course, once the guy had been arrested and it was clear something was going on, they wouldn't be showing that photo. Would that be correct?
Yeah, it's easy to forget that when this case started, there were strict reporting restrictions over his name, because he's a child. And ordinarily, as we've seen in a few cases recently, one thinks of the killing of Brianna Ghey, which involved 2 underage defendants. It's not normal to publish a defendant's identity, their name, and certainly not their photograph. So those reporting restrictions had to be lifted, which they were, by the court. It had nothing to do with Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer would have no legal power whatsoever to put these images into the public realm or to censor them. Those were legal restrictions that always apply when it comes to the trial of a child. And of course, the fact that Rudakubana was a child when he committed these awful crimes will affect the sentence that he eventually receives, because he won't be allowed to have what's known as a whole life order, an order of the court that puts him into custody for the rest of his life. That he would need to be over 21 in order for that to be passed. So in all the monstrous characteristics of this, it's just the case that there are certain rules that govern the trial of children.
But even when he was, I was just going to say, look, even when he was named, because he was just shy of his 18th birthday, and I think the name would have probably come out, I mean, sometimes in some circumstances, as you know, as a lawyer, a name will be released, but usually after a trial. But he was about to be 18, they did release his name, but they never released that mugshot. I think I'm right in saying that would have potentially been seen as prejudicial as well, had they done so. And the fact that at that stage he'd been charged with murder, many counts of murder, would be the reason why it wasn't in the public domain, not because anyone was covering up what looks like a man who does the kind of thing he turned out to do.
Yeah, it's perfectly normal for a mugshot image like this to be kept back from the public, principally because it's evidence in the case. So the mugshot photograph is a formal exhibit in the court case. It will be put before the jury to be considered. You know, we didn't see Lucy Letby's mugshot, the now famous mugshot, until after she was convicted. You remember, for a long time, the only photo we had of her was a relatively innocuous one. So that again is perfectly normal. And I think people are justifiably alarmed by the mugshot photograph because it's an extremely striking image. He looks very, very different to the images that we had previously. And that probably gives you some insight into why these photos aren't put into the public realm, because defense teams and prosecution teams need to hash this out in court before it gets public. There are sensitive legal questions around what is fair and what is not to put before a jury, and it's right that the people involved in those trials resolve them without outside influence.
There it is. Luke, thank you. Very thorough stuff. Luke Gittos, lawyer, writer and director of the Freedom Law UK. Thank you to him.